Hi, welcome. This is Jelle from Growing Bonsai. Don't you just love juniper? I know I do. And that is why I've spent quite a bit of time figuring out how to take cuttings of these. By now, my combination of substrate and aftercare means that I get a very high, up to 100% success in rooting cuttings. Join me and I'll show you what I do so that all my cuttings root. People that follow my channel know that I like to propagate things. So in this case, juniper. Do you know that situation? You've just styled a juniper, you've done all the work, and then you're left with a whole bunch of leftovers. Now what to do with them? I, for one, like to produce cuttings. So there we go. A quick and easy way to get cuttings to grow from juniper bonsai. Let's take a look at the material. This is typical cut-offs from a styling. And for instance, this is a nice whip, but this is quite old already to get to root. So I'm going to cut it off here. Then I want at least a quarter of the stem to be in the ground, and I don't want any green there because that will just start to rot. So I remove this lower branching. Now, because it is a juniper and it is an older one, it helps for older material to scrape off the bark a little bit on the sides. That way they will root easier. So this is the largest cutting from junipers. Let's do this another 10 times for the rest of the material. I prefer the stems to be straight. Maybe a bit too much green. Small side branch also works as a cutting. Another somewhat old branch. As you can tell, I take small and I take big cuttings. It doesn't really matter. These all will root quite reliably. The last batch, see the last video where I styled this juniper, I had a 100% rooting. So all the cuts are prepared. Now it comes down to the rooting medium. Let's see what I use for that. So you prepare a pot. Use some coarse substrate at the bottom so that the substrate doesn't fall through. Add the normal substrate that you want the cuttings to root in. And leave a little bit of space on top of the pot. This is the secret ingredient, vermiculite. This is a mineral. You can find it in grow shops. And for those of you that live in countries that don't have grow shops, go to a specialty plant store. Soak the pot well. This way the vermiculite will better adhere to itself and it's easier to plant your cuttings. Once it starts draining from the bottom, you're all done. So we're back at the workbench and one of the essential tools, a chopstick. Who would have thought that things made to serve yourself food are so useful when growing bonsai? Punch a bunch of holes through the top layer of substrate. Take each cutting, press down into the substrate. This is the big one, it's going to go in the middle. Looks like I have more cuttings than I made holes. Let's make another 2, 3, 4 holes. Doesn't really matter at this stage because they will first need to root before they start growing. Planted. Now water them in. Done watering. What is good material to grow as a cutting? When you look at the juniper stem, you can very clearly see there is a distinction between brown and a green stem. This part was grown last year and it is starting to mature. You can see here slowly the stem is starting to go brown. This is the youngest that you can use. These side branches are from this year. They are too young. If you take this as a clipping, the chances are quite high that this will start rotting. So ideally you use something that has already a bit of wood on it. You could root the whole thing, but the risk is that then the cutting dries out. A little bit shorter than that. So this is better. Remove the material at the base so that you can plant it quite deep and it can root. This part, in fact, is already getting old. This is so thick that it takes a long time for a cutting to root. So ideally, these thicker parts you leave behind and you're just looking for the somewhat younger tree. So you're looking for youngish branches that are from a very strong whip. You can tell this one has grown really well last year. And that makes up the cuttings. This thickness is ideal. It's about as thick as a match, maybe a little thicker. And if you look at a rooted cutting like this, this is a little bit thinner and it was a little bit more mature. It started to go brown. Material 2-3 years old maximum. Not too thick, ideally a little bit thinner. Not completely green, already having some brown parts on it. That's ideal cutting size. These will take, but the risk of them dying off is higher. So in summary, this one is slightly old and quite thick. Not optimal. These are turning brown. Reasonably thickness. These are very good to use for cuttings. This will also work. This is the tip of the branch and this has started to turn woody as well. And another one that we haven't discussed is this one. It is a heel cutting. Basically you get a heel cutting by taking a young branch and just pulling it off. Then you see that there's a little heel on it. You don't want the whole heel to stay, you just clip the ends off. But these also make good cuttings that root quite reliably and fast. Here again, of course, you have to remove the lower branches. Otherwise you can't plant it without the foliage rotting. These are too small. They will root, but the chances of rotting are quite high. And you will lose half, maybe 2/3 of the cuttings. But maybe 1 in 3 of them will root. And this is what a cutting will look like a year later, after they have rooted. You may notice I am not using any rooting hormone. Juniper will grow quite reliably from a cutting without rooting hormone. What will happen is that here these wounds will start to callus over and the hormones that are produced in the foliage will push down, come to the callus, and then roots will start to develop. This is a slow process. Count on 6 to 12 months for the rootings to cut. But for junipers, you don't need rooting hormones. It doesn't make a difference. In fact, I sometimes have the feeling that rooting hormones on juniper cuttings hampers the development of roots. So I stay away from them. These I will pot up. These I'm not going to pot up. And I'll take a few more heel cuttings of this one. The white dots that you see on these cuttings are old flowers. They're no problem because no fruit has developed. However, here you see a tiny little fruit. And before you can root the cutting, it is always good to remove this because it takes a lot of energy away and it reduces the rooting. But now how do you know that the cuttings have rooted? If you look at this pot was taken last year and you can see the weeds are already invading. This one will not root, this one has died, it has dried out. And what you can tell is that the stem has not done anything. Now here you see that the tips are growing very slowly, but they have this bright green foliage on them. This is a sign that this cutting has taken and is starting to root. The same here. You see that the tip is starting to extend. This one is still in doubt, and you can see here the foliage is dying off at the bottom. And here's another cutting. This one was actually not in the soil. This is why it needs to be long. It can quite easily come out. You see that I used only 2 centimeters here. This is not enough to root. Overall, to know whether a cutting has rooted, you basically just check whether new growth is occurring. There are a lot of tips on the internet that say pull on the cutting. But if you pull on the cutting and it has just started to root, there's a big risk that you damage the new root tips and then the rooting will fail. So best is to just wait. Wait for the growing tips to start growing, and then you know rooting is happening or is about to happen. Because it takes quite a long time for juniper cuttings to root, I do not really pay attention to when I take the cuttings, and I take cuttings throughout the year. But in general, I found that the actual rooting of the cuttings often occurs in fall or in early spring. So I try to take the cuttings around that time, that when I plant them, they fairly quickly start rooting. And in fact, late summer seems to be an optimal time to take the cuttings, but I've not really tried it as I have so many cuttings that I can produce. I typically just stick them whenever I'm pruning my juniper and I'll see what takes. And at some cases that's 100% and other cases that's only 20 or 30%, but I'm just playing with trees in my backyard. I'm not a commercial nursery and my livelihood doesn't depend on all of these cuttings to strike, so I'm just doing it for the fun of it. Therefore, I just plant whenever I have the time, whenever I have the cuttings, I put them in a sheltered spot and I wait. This overgrown corner of my yard is my place to root cuttings. There's no wind, there's a little bit of sunlight in the early afternoon, but the rest of the day it just sits there. The plants actually keep the humidity up. These are all cuttings taken in fall. They will have rooted by the end of the year. There they go. And that's it. So what did I tell you? Was this a fast video or what? Now, if you haven't done yet, watch the video in which I styled this juniper. The link is down below. Not subscribed yet? This is the time to do so because the video is going to end now.